Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining this live stream. I'll be using Affinity Photo to do some photographic post-production work. Now, my aim is to showcase some of the workflows I've been using recently for non-destructive editing and give you a few tips and techniques for taking your photography further with a little bit of extra editing. I've got around 6 examples lined up, and they're a mix of landscape and nature/wildlife imagery. And if you look in the live chat and the description, you'll find a Dropbox link where you can download the original files and follow along if you'd like. Probably at your own speed, perhaps, because I'm not going to stop and explain things in too much detail like I do with the tutorials. This is more just kind of like a, come and watch and watch what I typically do and so on. So I'm not going to go full speed, but not tutorial speed either, somewhere in the middle. Okay, so let's begin with this photograph I took of the moon. I posted this on Instagram a few days ago, and someone said it would be useful to know the process for extracting detail on the moon's surface. So I thought it'd be nice to cover that, and also it gives me a nice, easy edit to warm up with for this stream. Okay, so first of all, I'm actually going to, this is a raw file. I shot this using a handheld high-res mode on my Olympus camera, which is why the pixel resolution up here is a little bit higher than you might imagine for that camera. And controversially, I'm actually going to do no editing in the develop persona where you develop the raw file at all. It's just develop as is. Okay, it's kind of an interesting concept to wrap your head around, I suppose. I don't really tend to do much raw development at all. I tend to just start with a sort of a flat, neutral looking image, and then I do all of my work with layers in the main photo persona. Just drag that down a bit, give myself a bit more room for layers. Okay, so first of all then, I want to show you a trick to enhance texture and structure. So this is primarily, I think, what the person on Instagram was commenting about, was this technique. So first I duplicate the layer, the raw layer in this case, and then I'll add a clarity filter. I'll set it to 100% strength, okay? Now this on its own is quite effective. It brings out a lot of structure in the surface of the moon here. But we're going to do something to just bring out a little bit extra detail, which I think makes the difference. So I'm actually going to duplicate this result here, and then, where is it gone? Bilateral blur. I'll apply a bilateral blur filter. It has the settings that I use most frequently here. So I bring the radius all the way up, and then the tolerance to about 20%. So bilateral blur is an edge-preserving blur filter, and you can use it, as I'll show you, with a bit of extra blending to effectively create either a mask, like an edge mask, or you can use that edge detail, which I'm going to show you how to extract, to blend and enhance further. So let me apply that. It might take a second or two because it's using a 100 pixel kernel is quite intensive. There we go. Okay. So now what I'll do is I'll set this layer's blend mode to subtract. Okay, so now we're just getting the subtracted difference or detail between these two layers over here. Okay, so now I will merge visible. So typically that's on your layer menu here, but I use the shortcut Shift Option Command E. Okay, and now I've created a merged layer of that subtracted difference. Okay, so now I can delete this layer, the one I ran the bilateral blur on. And then this layer, I want to set the blend mode to screen. You can use add, which actually makes it even more intense. But the issue with a linear addition is that you could easily overexpose information, such as here, for example, whereas a screen blend mode will give you a nice highlight roll-off and avoid that. So sometimes I use add, sometimes I use screen. It really depends on the image, to be honest. Okay, and then you merge that down, so Command D, merge that down into that layer, and then you've got your textural enhancement layer. So there's the before, there's the after. Now you could take this a step further, so if I undo to where I've got that, there we go. Okay, I could actually duplicate the, I'm getting lost now, the subtracted information layer, duplicate that, and then merge these both down. So merge the first one, then the second one, and now you've got an even stronger enhancement effect. So perhaps, at this point it might be too strong. Let's try an opacity of say 50%. So this still gives us, if I show you the before and the after, it doesn't just enhance the texture, it also enhances kind of like the contrast of the micro detail. And so without using any other kind of adjustments like brightness, contrast or curves, we've actually created a bit more of the contrast between, I think, the moon and the sky. Now at this point I might just chuck on a basic brightness contrast adjustment. I have set my custom shortcuts, by the way, so just be aware of that. That isn't a default shortcut. Let's put the brightness up. Excuse me, and contrast down. Something like that. Sometimes it seems a bit backwards almost, but sometimes I will flatten contrast only to bring it back later. It depends on the whole editing process. Sometimes I'm just kind of, working as I go, and I think I'll try it with less contrast, maybe boost the brightness a little bit, but then later on I might decide actually to go the other way. But that's fine. That's what a non-destructive layer stack is for. Okay, now at this point I am going to introduce a macro. Macros are a bit like actions in Photoshop. They enable you to dramatically speed up your workflow. There isn't anything natively, macros don't do anything that you can't do natively. They just make the process easier and quicker. So I've set myself up some macros here. I have this Luma masked curves macro and a weighted version. I'm going to run that. Essentially what it does is photographers like to use luminosity masking a lot. I'll just hide that for now. Essentially where you're kind of iteratively using various adjustments but blended into specific tonal regions like shadows, highlights, midtones and so on. And some of them get quite advanced with it. So what I've done is set myself up 3 curve layers. And on the blend options here, you'll see that actually on the underlying graph, this is like our blend if, our equivalent, except you do it with a spline graph rather than a slider. And so you have these 3 curves adjustments that are targeted towards very specific tonal regions. But on top of that, they're also using a luminosity blend mode. So rather than, I'm getting a bit technical, sorry, this early on, but effectively, it uses weighted luminosity based on kind of the human visual perception. So we're most sensitive to green, then red, then blue. So rather than affect the red, green, blue channels equally, it weights it so that green is affected the most, then red, then blue. And what you'll notice is that, especially when it comes to color intensity, when you're pushing the curve graphs around, you tend to end up with less intense colors if you say push tones up and so on. Anyway, I'm waffling now, so let me just start with, say, the shadows. Essentially the reason, sorry, I think, not to carry on with that discussion, but the reason I sometimes use a weighted luminosity is simply so that you're treating kind of like the luminosity of the image, so like the calculated brightness, the weighted brightness, and not really touching the color information too much. So it's kind of unbiased in that sense. Okay, so what have I done here? I've just kind of pushed the shadow detail up a little bit around here, and then on the midtones, I might just drag them down slightly. Yeah, just for, some moodier midtones going on there. And then on the highlights, maybe I'll just push up like so, and oh, look at that, really make them sing, to use a phrase. Okay, and so because I've separated them into 3 tonal regions, the result is obviously quite different compared to if you just use a single curves adjustment and try to push your way around all the, the entire tonal range altogether. Stefan, what tool do you use to display your key presses so nicely? It's called Keystroke Pro, and it's on the App Store. Sadly, I haven't found a decent Windows equivalent, but it is very nice. Yeah, all your modifier keys and of course all your optional, your normal keyboard keys as well. It's very useful. I think you see it in the tutorials as well, I think. Okay, so moving on then. Let's add an HSL adjustment. And I think I'll go over to the blues and take the luminosity down. So we're reducing the overall luminosity of the blues. So we're bringing out, again, we're contrasting the moon quite nicely with the background sky. If anyone's a little confused, by the way, why, it's essentially, this is a morning shot. I got in my car ready to go to work, looked up, saw the moon, and it was just really bright in a kind of a sunrise sky, just pure blue sky. And I thought, wow, I've got to photograph that. And I did photograph the moon the previous evening. But yeah, the daytime shot was just vastly better, and it's so much more interesting, I think, because you've got this blue sky to contrast it with. Okay, now I'll show you a technique. I've probably shown this before in tutorials and previous live streams, but I do like to use it quite a lot. We can take advantage of filters, live filters rather, that Affinity Photo offers, to apply things like the Orton effect non-destructively. So, you know, when you merge or reduplicate a layer, or convert it to a smart layer, then you apply a smart blur filter, etc., etc. In Photo, you can just apply a live filter, drag the radius up, and then change your blend mode. So, for example, we could go for something like hard light. It's a bit too excessive at the moment, but if we go into our blend options here, so that's a little cog icon, I can take this down in the source layer, and I think the underlying composition, maybe just push this up a little bit on the underlying graph. And there we go, there's the before, there's the after. So we get this nice kind of diffuse glow effect, especially around the brighter areas of the moon, and it just makes everything look a bit more pleasing, I suppose. Okay, next then I might add a selective color adjustment. Again, I've set a shortcut up for that because I use it so frequently. And across on the blues, let's try something dramatic. Let's put all the sliders to 100. And again, it's just, I was just playing around. I didn't really mean to do that, but the effect is that it just darkens that blue sky a little bit on the moon as well. But again, it just kind of brings out that separation there. Janelle, yes, actually, it is. It's a free download. If you go on my website, you'll find what they're called photographic retouching macros. I do have a V2 I'm working on, which I haven't actually released yet, so there's a few extra things in here, but that does have the Luma masked curves and HSL, which I'll use later as well. Okay. Okay, so hands off. I don't really want to over-edit this or overthink it too much. One thing I will do, though, is add some sharpening. So, again, I'll use a macro for that, bandpass sharpening. And there's a little bit of an interesting history behind this. So, I do a lot of astrophotography. We work closely with Telescope Live, who offer remote imaging, and it's a great challenge. The technical challenge of post-processing astrophotography data is there's so many facets to it. It's fascinating. And one of the things that is a popular astrophotography sharpening technique is called absolute point of focus. And someone developed a Photoshop plugin for it and so on. It was quite interesting, but then I watched a video on it, and when you break it down, effectively what it is just multiple bandpass filters that are blended together. And so that's actually quite easy to recreate in Photo in a non-destructive manner. You just stack a bunch of high-pass filters on top of one another with differing radii. So you've got, for example, the fine or the micro version, 0.5, 0.7, 1, 1.2, 1.4, 1.5, and then you set them all to a soft light blend mode. And I implemented this, used it for astrophotography. It was great for that. And then I thought, hang about, this is actually quite useful for any type of image editing, really, including photography. So it's really nice because it gives you this kind of, I'll show you before and the after. It gives you this nice kind of almost subtle micro contrast enhancement, but without any of the typical sharpening artifacts where you've got almost too much contrast, you've got ringing around edge detail and so on. And so it's a really quite an effective technique. It doesn't work for all imagery I've found, but for the vast majority of imagery, it's quite useful. So I tend to use that now. Okay. Actually, in the high-pass video tutorial on the Affinity Photo channel, near the end of the video, I actually talk you through how to set that up. So if you're interested, go and watch that. Okay, crop. Let's crop in. Let's have a nice tight crop on the moon. So let's go for something like this, perhaps, or maybe a bit more of a square ratio. So I'll lock that off with Shift. There we go. Okay, somewhere like there. Let's use the return key. How does that look? I like to zoom out to, it's a good tip actually. If you're trying to crop and find a composition, sometimes it helps to zoom out and look at it. You know, imagine you looking at it on a phone screen, or you're browsing a website and you see it. So this tells me actually that maybe I just need a little bit more down here, not too much, something like that, and maybe a little bit more headroom at the top as well. You can drive yourself bananas trying to find a good crop sometimes with these subjects, but yeah, I think I'm happy with that. The beauty, of course, is that all the cropping is non-destructive, so I can always come in at a later date and revise that. Right, let's save that result out. And I'm going to move on to the next one, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. We're going to look at masking, and I've developed a technique for, typically I would say, kind of close-up wildlife shots and that sort of thing, to really kind of make the most, you know, extract the most amount of quality and so on. And also, I'm big into the technical side of things, so I like images having compressibility as well, which is not having noise where it's not required, like flat background detail and so on. So I'll talk you through that. Geordie, I'll be honest and put my hands up here. I haven't really looked at, I have, you know, during my browsing, I've come across, you know, some mineral color processed photos and so on. It was in color, yeah. It was just with my Olympus camera, or OM system camera now, as that known. But I haven't really looked at any kind of that processing quite, so I couldn't particularly comment on that. But that is on my ever-evolving list of things to look at and see how to do, or, you know, what the process is behind it. Okay. Again, not much in the initial raw development here. Maybe just bring the black point to the left slightly, just to take the tones away from pure black. But other than that, I will click develop. And there we go. Okay. So this is my kind of bread and butter technique now that I'm going to show you for wildlife imagery and that sort of thing. Selection brush. So W twice. Use a larger brush, brush in, make a selection of your main subject. I like to use Q for quick mask to see what I've got selected and what is not in my selection. So there we go. That's good enough for me. I'm probably going to ignore the head feathers. Okay. Then once you've got your rough selection, refine it up here. Okay. Let's see, how much matting does this need? Let's just go around the edge detail like so. Okay. Looking good so far. Okay, right, now I'll click apply, and I have my refined subject selection. So with this selection active, I will now quickly add curves adjustment, HSL adjustment, and then I will invert the selection. So Shift-Command-I on Mac, Shift-Control-I on Windows. So now I've got the background selected, and then I'll do the same. I'll add curves, HSL, and then also I will add a live denoise filter. And then deselect. Okay, that got rid of the dialogue. That's what I wanted to show you. Okay, so effectively, this is just my basic setup to begin with. And I'll talk you through the two things I'm trying to achieve. So the first is the denoising. We'll see here, I'm a stickler for, you know, noise and getting rid of it where it's not required and so on. So noise in the background I want to eliminate. That's why I did a masked noise reduction filter. So drag that up, noise disappears. Okay, so that's step one. But the crucial thing is it's not affecting the textural detail of the main subject. So we've still got noise there. Therefore, we still have some texture. Okay. And the second step is separating the subject from the foreground further. So let's start with the background masked curves. And I will do something like that. Drag that down. Okay. And then I'll go to the background HSL adjustment. Make sure I'm on all colors. Desaturate that a little bit. And then go to the foreground curves. That's this one down here. Push this up ever so slightly, not by much, because then you can go too far and it just looks really obvious. You know, there's like, there you go. So you can see the separation there where the anti-aliased pixels are. That's not good. So we'll keep that down to a bare minimum, something like that. Okay. And then the HSL for the foreground will just increase the saturation slightly as well. Okay, so just from that work alone, we've managed to go from this photo where it's kind of balanced, yeah, but you know, the background detail is it's full of yellows and greens and it's quite bright. And then we've gone from that to that. So instantly we've got that subject pop, you know, the background just kind of fades away. Viewer's eye is focused really on the main subject. Okay. Now, at this point, I'll probably, I'll do that. The technique I used for the moon, so the local contrast and texture enhancement, I call it. I did turn it into a macro just to save time. So it basically does the same technique that I just showed in the moon photo. There we go. Let's run that local contrast and texture. So it does clarity, then the bilateral blur, then the subtract, not mask, sorry, but the difference and so on. Okay, yeah, so it starts out way too strong. So you also have a mask. So I'm going to invert that. Get my paintbrush tool, make sure I'm set to white. There we go. And then paint in over the areas where I want that effect to apply. Okay. Looking good. It's perhaps a little bit too strong. So let's take the opacity down 50% maybe. And let's see what that looks like. So here's the before, here's the after. So overall, it's just this really nice kind of, it's bringing out the contrast of all that micro detail, just making things perceptually a little bit brighter as well. So that's quite nice. Okay. Let's see. I think also I'll use my weighted Luma masked curves again. I've started using these more and more recently now. That's why I created macros, just to set everything up and make it so much quicker. So I found many benefits in separating out the tonal range when it comes to doing things like curves. So for example, highlights, you see there, obviously don't go too far, but you can just use it to kind of bring down the overall intensity of the highlights, and that's sometimes quite useful. And then the midtones, I might create a node down here and then just do a kind of a quick small S-curve shape. Just have a bit of general contrast in there. And then the highlights, the shadows even, went back up to the highlights. These shadows, I don't know, I might leave these alone. Or maybe just push them up ever so slightly. So actually, when all is said and done, the tonal difference is so minute. You see the difference there? It's almost like we've just taken some of the contrast back a little bit, and we've stopped the highlights. It just brought down the intensity a tiny amount. But sometimes that's okay. You know, there's no rule book that says every adjustment or every filter you add has to have like a dramatic purpose. You can build up a very complex layer stack that makes all of these minuscule edits if that's the way you find you like to work. There's no particular rule book on this. Let's see. I might introduce more. Yeah, okay. So let's try. I don't know how good this will look, but let's try separating foreground and background even further. So I'll command click on the foreground mask to reselect that. Let's add a curves adjustment there. And then I'll command click on the background mask. Oh, he says, come on. There we go. And then add a curves adjustment for that. Okay, and let's just bring that down a little bit. And then curves, on the foreground, can we push that up any more? Maybe a tiny amount. Okay, and I know you might be thinking, well, why don't you just go back to the original adjustments down here and modify them? But again, if you're working non-destructively, it helps to kind of compartmentalize the kind of successive edits that you're making. So maybe you're of the mindset at this point, I'll try and increase that difference between foreground and background detail. But if you do it separately, you can always roll it back or change it at a later date. Whereas if I went and modified these original layers, I'd then have a situation where maybe I wasn't sure about that later on, but it's too late because I've already modified those adjustments, so I can't remember what they were originally. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Also, what I might do is introduce a pixel layer. So I use a shortcut for that, Shift-Command-N or Shift-Control-N on Windows. And I also have a shortcut for the overlay blend mode because I use it so often. So Shift-O. Get the paintbrush tool. Oh, sorry, actually. Let's take the opacity down, otherwise that's going to be way too strong. Get the paintbrush tool. brush into the eye. Okay, is that a little bit excessive? Maybe. Just to enhance the eye detail, really bring it out. Let's try 40% opacity. Yeah, that's quite nice. Okay. All right. And then I'm pretty happy with that. So let's do our sharpening again. So let's go to sharpening. Let's try the bandpass sharpening. And oh yeah, look at that. This is exactly why I thought this astrophotography sharpening technique is so useful for general imagery as well. Look at the clarity and the detail it really brings out of subjects like this. So that's really quite nice. There's the before and there's the after. So yeah, I'm happy with that. Okay. Cropping wise, maybe I'll just take a bit off the top, bring the left in a little bit, something like that. Okay, yeah, this is interesting. I've just spotted an issue here. Obviously the selection refinement, the matting didn't quite work too well over here. So let's see, is that going to be on all the masks? Yes, it is. Okay, so here's how I'm going to tackle that. I'm going to get the brush tool and I'm just going to solo that mask and just brush in a little bit. I'm going to have to take a hit on the precision of this here because frankly, it was my mistake, and going back and modifying all of the masks, or rather recreating all of it, is not something I particularly want to get into. So I'm just alt-clicking on all of these masks, by the way, to solo them. And depending on whether it's a foreground or a background mask, I need to paint with black or white. So that's what I was doing. I was switching between those as well. Okay. Oh, it's still there. You're kidding me. Okay. So in this case, let's roll it all back. Let's see where it all first begins. So this is a good technique, by the way, if you're finding that with with your own masking and you've messed it up a little bit like I have. Okay, so it is at the very beginning. Yeah. Okay. So let's go in. Let's take a little bit more off there, I think. And a little bit more off there. And then switch over. There we go. That's starting to look better. Okay. And then let's turn these layers back on. And yeah, that actually looks okay now. That's fine. So it was just those bottom layers I didn't quite brush over with as much precision as I needed to for that to work. Right, yeah, I'm quite happy with that. So let's save that out. I do love it when things go slightly wrong on stream as well, because I think it's really useful, although it doesn't do much for my kudos. It's really useful to see how to fix those problems as well. So hopefully I can get away with that. Okay, right. So let's move on to the... I'll just look at the questions first. Yeah. A video. If we've got time, well, actually, I'm coming to a couple of landscape examples after this next one. So I'll show you some landscape editing techniques there. Janelle, best first method. Until such a date as we have something more advanced, I would use the selection brush tool like I did with this, and then use quick mask to, a quick mask basically helps you see what's in your selection. So it's really useful for high contrast edge, where you can't quite see the marching ants. Okay. Can't I just copy the mask? Yeah, I could do. I could make a spare channel and then load it into all the other channels. Good catch there. Could have done that. Interesting you do the cropping last, I do it first most of the time. Yeah, I prefer to do all kind of main editing on the entire image and then crop as a final thing. I just think once you've done all of your editing, it maybe helps inform the final composition that you might want to take. I find that a lot. You might end up enhancing a certain area that you would have kind of thought, no, I'll crop that out to begin with. But then actually, once you finish editing, you might quite like the look of it. So I always reserve cropping judgment until last. Okay, speckled wood butterfly. Let's see, what should we do here? So in terms of the raw development, again, not a lot. I might just bring the highlights down around about here, just to remove the specular brightness on the wing. Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at this. There really isn't much else I'm going to do. I know that's very disappointing to some people that kind of hinge more on the raw development side of things, but you know, once you actually get into working with layers and masking and everything else, it kind of, you might want to be of the same mindset, you know, save all your best editing tricks for where you have the most control and precision. Okay, so let's do the same thing that I did previously. So I'm going to get my selection brush, brush in to the main subject. I know it's a bit rough at the moment. I'm going to tidy it up. So this is a particularly difficult subject to make a selection of sometimes. So let's go in here. There we go. Okay, right. Then refine it. Luckily, we're not trying to do a cutout. With a lot of wildlife imagery, I shoot with a telephoto lens and a 2x adapter, and I think it's an equivalent focal length of 1200 millimeters. And even at f8, which is your maximum aperture you can have, the depth of field is still quite thin. So, yeah, it's sometimes difficult. I mean, if you're ever trying to do a cutout, you'd have your work stacked against you there because parts of the subject would still be falling away from sharpness, regardless of what you were doing there. So I'm blathering on a little bit. Here we go. Right. So here is my nice refined foreground selection. So I'll do the same thing again, you know, curves, HSL for the foreground, invert the selection, curves, HSL, and then denoise. Here we go. Okay, so I'll show you this procedure again. I'll deselect. So if I zoom in here we've got the noise, okay? And notice we've also got the noise around the butterfly, the subject. Bring luminance slider up. Noise from background disappears. We still get that noise or texture in the main subject. Okay, let's see. So we'll go into the background curves. That's this one. Drag that down. Go into the HSL for the background mask. Drag that down as well. Decrease the saturation. And then in the foreground, we'll push that up like so. And then HSL, just push the saturation up as well. Okay. I likely will be doing some further work on this foreground background separation again. Okay, top of the layer stack then. Let's add a curves adjustment. I'm going to push up the shadow detail like so. And then maybe just do something like that. Okay. And also, I'll toy with the idea of using a luminosity blend mode for this. Let's see what happens. Yeah, okay. That's ever so subtle. So let me zoom in and show you the difference here. So when I use a weighted luminosity, so remember, that's the sensitivity weighted more towards green, then red, then blue. So the color channels are not treated equally. Here's what a normal blend mode does. So more intense greens. And there's what a luminosity does. So it's ever so subtle, but if you look at the luminosity again, so normal, luminosity, the green intensity or the yellow intensity is decreased slightly. Okay, looking good. Let me just check that. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so let's, okay. This is an interesting technique. I like to do non-destructive dodging and burning, sometimes on a much wider scale than you might think. So I've added a new pixel layer, set the blend mode to overlay. Let's try 25% opacity, get the paintbrush tool. There was a question from, not a question, Stefan. Yeah, the square bracket keys for brush size on the German keyboard. You can try Control-Alt and left-click and drag for width and hardness. I don't know if you're aware of that modifier, but that is a useful thing if bracket keys are difficult on the German keyboard. So what I like to do here is, you might think this is a bit ridiculous really, but I like to dodge in using a really large brush over the background. Sometimes I just like to take a slightly more artistic approach. I need to just erase away from the head there. There we go. Okay. So you see the before and the after, and sometimes that's actually quite effective. Maybe I'll drop it to 20%. It might be a bit too strong, but Yeah, there we go. So always worth experimenting with this kind of thing. Feels a bit weird, you know, doing a really large brush just to darken a background, but hey, sometimes it's quite effective. Let's do another pixel layer. Overlay blend mode. Let's try 25% opacity again. Go into the eye. Oh, sorry, wrong. Hit the P key there. There we are. And just brush in with white. There we go. Okay, so nothing too dramatic, just increasing the brightness area around the eye there, just to make it a bit more forthcoming for the viewer. And then I'll try, it's not quite matte black. There aren't any pure black tones, I don't think. If looking at the scope panel here, nearly black, but I'll just show you a little technique as well. If you use a levels adjustment, you can use the output black level to raise or kind of compress the black level, and that's how you end up with this sort of slight matte black appearance. And now I keep yo-yoing really in terms of having these nice rich dark black tones and then having this kind of compressed matte black look. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. So I'll apply it here and see how I feel by the end of the image. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I think I'll command click on the background mask to load it again and add a curves adjustment, and I'll just darken the background further, a little bit like that. How far can I push this before it starts to look bad? Let's try slightly further down, something like there maybe. And then I'll see what luminosity blend mode does here. Oh no, okay. So that's actually retaining the color intensity rather than decreasing it. Whereas I actually want that. So I'll leave it in a normal blend mode. What I will do though is get the brush tool, go in with white, and just paint around the edges here. Just simply because I think, you know, there's some obvious haloing around the edge of the butterfly, which I'm not keen on. So we'll just bring that mask in a little bit. Okay. Yeah, that's quite a dramatic difference. Let's see. Do I dare try the foreground as well? Let's give it a try. So load the foreground mask, do another curves adjustment, and let's just push these tones. Oh, whoa, that's looking slightly too burnt out. Maybe just take that down slightly. Something like that. Okay. I'll just have a look at the questions while I'm here. A video, yeah, in the future, to be honest with you, if we're being upfront about this, raw development will never be a sole, you know, like a primary focus in terms of the workload that has to be prioritized. But it does get improvements over time. I mean, in 1.7, for example, the demosaicing method was completely rewritten, and that just provided the basis for much higher quality imagery to begin with. A little bit soft, so it needs extra sharpening, but since you're using mostly a post-processing workflow in photo, that's kind of okay. Yeah, at the moment, the highlight recovery is, I don't struggle with it too much, actually. I'd be interested to know if you have any specific examples, or if you go to the forum, you can kind of post some examples where maybe it's failed you a little bit. There are some separate issues around colors, like really intense blues and purples and magentas not looking quite right, and I believe that's being worked on as well, if that's what you might be referring to. Oh, sorry, Stefan. Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in so far. Much appreciate it. Take care. Okay, Geordie. Yeah, okay. The scope. So essentially, this will be familiar with anyone who's worked with video editing software. The scope panel, as opposed to the histogram, the reason I have this open all the time, is because you get this abstract sort of spatial representation of the tones in your image, as opposed to the histogram. It's just much more useful. So, whereas, let's say, for example, in the histogram, let's say I use an exposure adjustment and push this up. Okay, so a histogram will tell you that tones are clipping. It will tell you, you know, especially the green and the blue, you can see there. Okay, that's great. I know I have clipped tones, but where are they? It doesn't tell me that. it's kind of a controversial opinion to say that the histogram is marginally quite useless for most cases like that. But I've just reset my, here we go. Sorry. I've made a boo-boo. Let me just reset my studio. There we go. Okay. Get the scope panel back. Where was I? Sorry. So yeah, whereas a scope panel will actually tell you from left to right in your image where those tones are that are overexposing or clipping. And in fact, you can switch it from intensity, which again is, remember I talked about the luminosity, like the weighted calculation of red, green and blue values. That's what intensity is. But you can switch it to an RGB waveform as well, and you can see the distribution of tones there. So you can see the green tones have more intensity than the reds and the blues and so on. And you have other things like vector scope for skin tone as well. Anyone who uses video editing software should be instantly at home with these. So yeah, I tend to use an intensity waveform for most. I barely ever look at the histogram at all. The only time I have to really put up with the histogram is in the raw development workspace or persona. But there we go, I use the scope for most things. Okay, let's see. I might add a selective color. Again, I've set a shortcut up for that. I think I'm repeating myself there. But then on the reds, I'll take the cyan down. In fact, no, you know what? I'm going to delete that. And instead, I'm going to load the background mask and do a selective color off that. So I'm just affecting... Sorry, did I say background? I meant foreground. So I'm just affecting the foreground detail. So let's take the cyans down on the reds there. And then on the yellows, I'll take the cyan down as well. Maybe not too much. That's a little bit too dramatic. Maybe around there. Yeah, okay. All right, at this point then, the background detail to the left and the bottom left is starting to annoy me a little bit. I don't like it. It takes away from the main composition. So what I'll do is go right down my layer stack, create a new pixel layer above the raw layer, get the inpainting brush tool, set the sampler to current layer and below. And you can do this with all the retouching tools, by the way. So like the clone brush, healing brush, and so on. And then brush into here, like so. And hopefully it will do a good job. Yeah, just a little bit in here, just needs taken care of. Okay, good. And then down here as well, let's just brush in like so. Just a little bit here. You probably can't see it on the actual live stream. Don't know if there's enough precision, but in the video stream. But yeah, there was a little bit down there that I just had to tidy up. And there we go. I've done that non-destructively. So the beauty here is that you don't break, if you're using linked RAW, you don't break the link. If you're using embedded RAW, you can still go in and redevelop if you need to, although you would then have to change this anyway. But yeah, it's a non-destructive change. You can just kind of show that and hide that. Okay. Oh, you know what? I think, looking at this, there was a mark on the... Yes, there's a mark on the moth's eye here. Sorry, the butterfly's eye. So let's just go in and remove that as well. And this sort of specular detail here, let's tidy that up. Good, okay. Just these little minute details that I'm kind of catching now and wanting to address. Okay. I think this is looking pretty good, actually. I might kind of leave it there, I think. One thing I might do, though, is get a background mask, load it up, do another HSL, take the saturation down again, sorry, just to kind of really promote a focus. Not color pop it, because I think color popping is awful, but just take enough of that yellowish tone out and reddish tone out of the background so it's not distracting from the main subject. Okay. Finally then, let's do something like a brightness contrast adjustment. Push brightness contrast up. Okay. And then what I'll do is get the paintbrush tool, set it to black, my active color, and just brush out of the wing area just to avoid brightening that too much. There we go. By the way, you've kind of seen this throughout, but essentially adjustments and filters have their own alpha channels, and therefore you can just paint directly onto them. You don't need to remember to select a mask that's clipped to them like you might do in Photoshop. It's a little bit of a behavioral change, but it's worth pointing out because people end up adding adjustments and then adding a mask using this option here, which creates a mask and gives you a second mask on top of the mask that the adjustment already has. So it's kind of redundant, so you don't need that. Let's get my macros up and just add some bandpass sharpening. There we go. Nice. Maybe take that down a tad, 80%. Yeah, okay, and I'm happy with that. So let's save that out and move on to the next one. So we're now going to venture into HDR. Which one should I start with? Let's start with Snowdonia, okay? So this is just a typical bracketed set of exposures to capture more dynamic range, as you can see, just crunching through the TIFF files here. Okay. Yeah, so let's load those in. And it's probably a good opportunity to talk a little bit about HDR and EDR, not to be conflated with high dynamic range tone mapping. I'll explain anyway. So let's go and add our files. Let's go in here, go to Snowdonia, add the files. We don't want noise reduction and we don't want to tone map either. Okay, so click OK, let it do its magic. Okay, just see any other questions. I was a histogram guy, but this will change. Yeah, it's so much more useful than a histogram, trust me. Janelle, I'm trying to think. Is there a video tutorial? I'll just try and remember to check at the end, Janelle. But I think there's actually a video tutorial on how to use the scope panel. I think I've done one, which might be worth watching. I'll see if I can find it at the end. Or if I forget, I will post it in the comments on this live stream so you can check afterwards. Thomas, if you need to sharpen, do you recommend to do it immediately after the background layer, or can you sharpen on top of all the other layers? So it's up to you. You can sharpen at any point during your editing. It's entirely up to you. I just prefer to do it as like a final step. Cropping, sharpening, I always regard as final steps at the end. I'm trying to think of any particular advantages. No, not really. It's just that, more or less, sharpening shouldn't really affect the tonality of anything else, to be honest. One thing might be worth bearing in mind, though, is if you sharpen and then you do something on top of that, like clarity, anything kind of structural, like, that technique I showed with the moon, enhancing the structure and so on, you probably want to just do that on your unsharpened data, not the sharpened data. But again, your mileage may vary. Can you do something about the light leaf below the butterfly? Michael, sorry, I've moved on to the next example now. Not really if it's encroaching on the butterfly. That's kind of beyond really reasonable expectations for retouching and so on. Janelle, is left to right on the scope shadow to highlight? No, it works. It's top and bottom. So you see on the intensity waveform, you've got 100 and you've got 0. That's intensity. So 100 is full white or full intensity. 0 is full black or 0 intensity. So it's like a representation of your image from left to right. So you see here, for example, you've got all this peaking, all this bright white here, that's over there. And then you've got some slightly less bright cloud detail here. You can see that there. And you can see the kind of the mountainous detail taking shape there, hopefully. Some images show that much clearer than others. All right, where were we? Yes, okay, so this is the HDR merged 32-bit linear document. There's a lot to unpack there, basically. But essentially, I want to point something out before we move on to tone mapping and so on. You'll see I've just brought up the 32-bit preview panel there. Now, if you're using a MacBook, like a recent MacBook with an EDR-capable display, I think they call it XDR. iPad as well, this is the same for the iPad app. You will be seeing extended brightness values by default because EDR will be on. Okay, it makes no difference on my monitor. My monitor is standard dynamic range, and this stream is SDR anyway, so there's no difference there. But essentially, I think this is worth pointing out because what people are doing is doing their HDR merges, They're making, they're doing their edits, blah, 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 and they're not even tone mapping because they're actually seeing, if I bring the preview exposure down, they're actually seeing all those really nice bright values and they're thinking, oh, wow, that looks good without me having to do anything. So they don't even think to tone map it. Or if it takes them into the tone mapping persona, they cancel out and say, well, I prefer how it looked originally, like that. But the problem is when they go to export to a bounded format, what we call a bounded format, like JPEG or just basic TIFF or something like that, your result will look like this rather than that glorious HDR expanded brightness thing that you were just seeing. So it's really important if you're going to be doing HDR editing for an SDR delivery that you disable this. On Windows, this will say HDR. Disable that entirely, and then your result will look like this instead. So now we have all these values outside standard dynamic range that we need to tone map into standard dynamic range. I prefer not to use the tone mapping persona. I find, I find it difficult to kind of get a natural looking result half the time. So I use my own macros for this. I'm a bit of a nerd, you might be able to tell, using procedural texture filtering, procedural texture equations in Photo. I've developed a number of, I've kind of messed around, created my own, and then I've implemented some popular tone mapping techniques that you can find, available on the internet, on GitHub and various shader sites and so on. So, for example, there's just neutral tone mapping, and when I run this, it just creates a group that gives you that tone mapping effect, like so. There's some more interesting options like color preserving, so you get a little bit more color detail there. It's almost pointless showing you all these on this image because there isn't actually a lot of intense color detail going on here. We've got Reinhardt as well, by the way. That's a very popular tone mapping method. Filmic, ACES, which I'm not a massive fan of, to be honest. And then some other techniques down here. For this purpose, I'll just go with neutral tone mapping. Okay. And, it just sits there as a group, so you can go and you can change the base exposure if you need to, that sort of thing. But actually, I'll just reset that. I'm quite happy with how it looks by default. And then I'm going to do a very, not controversial, but interesting thing. Despite having this non-destructive tone mapping, I am actually going to, I'll put the history on for you there, I'm going to flatten and convert it to 16-bit. So document, flatten. So now I've got all of my tone mapped color values here, okay, pixel values. So everything is within standard dynamic range. So I can now comfortably convert it to 16-bit rather than 32-bit. So 16-bit is a bounded format. It doesn't support high dynamic range. And I'm actually going to use sRGB rather than Adobe RGB just for the sake of simplicity. Okay. Now the reason I do this rather than continue working in 32-bit is because 8-bit and 16-bit are gamma encoded or gamma corrected formats. Essentially everything, there's power transforms going on. Everything is kind of gamma corrected from linear to non-linear. Whereas in 32-bit, all your compositing, everything that happens in the layer stack, when you're using tools, filters, adjustments, it all happens in linear space. And I suppose the most relatable way of putting it would be that converting to 16-bit gives you a more predictable behavior, because most of your imagery you'll probably be editing in 8-bit or 16-bit to begin with. So that everything, all the blending, the way adjustments and filters behave, the way tools behave, especially with blending modes and so on, it's a little bit more predictable as opposed to linear compositing, which, adjustments do behave differently. Sharpening behaves differently. You have more issues with black haloing around edge detail with linear sharpening and so on. So that's the long-winded explanation of why once I've tone mapped, I tend to go into 16-bit anyway, because I just find it more predictable to work with. So let's use curves. I'll drag that down. Maybe something quite dramatic down there. Okay. And then I'll create a pixel layer. Again, overlay blend mode. So Shift O for me. Opacity down to 50 as well. Paintbrush tool, let's paint in, I think I'll paint into the middle foreground here. Wow, yeah, okay, 50% is too strong for this. So once I've finished with the brush tool, I'll just erase that area over there. Once I've finished with the brush tool, I'll take that down to maybe 30. Yeah, that looks good. Let's do another pixel layer then. overlay blend mode, 20% opacity this time. Let's get the brush tool. Let's see. Switch to black, and I'm going to darken the sky, and then darken the foreground as well. Looking at this, maybe just a third pixel layer. This time 10% opacity. Get the paintbrush tool, go in, and then I'm just going to brighten up some of these areas where the light is hitting the valley down below. Okay. At this point, then, let's try an HSL adjustment. And let's go to the yellows, bring the luminosity up. So that brightens the yellow detail, but it's severely desaturated as well. So let's bring the saturation up as well. Okay, something like that. This is still quite a grey looking image, you know. I will eventually get round to this because I tend to be quite a colourful person in my editing. So this is very much going against what I would usually be doing at this stage, I think. Now, let's go to the bottom pixel layer, and I'll run that macro again. That's, where's it gone? The local contrast and texture macro, single layer version. So again, this is nothing that you can't do manually. It's that technique I showed for the moon. Way too strong. Look at the state of this. Okay, so let's invert that mask, paint back in with white. I'll paint into the middle area detail here, and this is still far too strong. So I don't know, let's take this down a bit, maybe to around 30%. 40 maybe, something like that. So it's quite hard to see maybe. Let's just show you the before and the after. There we go. So again, it's just really brought out some rich details down there that's quite nice. Okay. Now the next thing I'll do, and this is really probably outside the comfort zone of most photographic workflows. I'm going to use the pen tool, and I'm going to enhance the God rays, or I think you could call them the crepuscular rays that are coming down between the clouds here. So I will start drawing a polycurve from about here. Let's try and roughly follow the shape of the God rays, something like that. Okay. And then I'll set the fill of this to pure white. I know, okay, this looks bizarre, but bear with me. Then I'll go to Window, Quick Effects, bring out the Quick Effects panel. Add a Gaussian blur to this, drag the radius up all the way, okay. Hopefully starting to see where I'm going with this. And then I'll use something like a soft light blend mode and just take the opacity down maybe to around, let's try 30, maybe 40, something like that. Okay, so then if I turn this, oh, sorry, that should be up there on the layer stack. There we go. If I show you the before and the after, it's very subtle, but again, maybe even too subtle. Let's try 50%, but it just kind of accentuates those God ray areas, which is quite nice for this image. Okay. Let's see, any questions? Zizo, coming from video, looks like working on log gamma after tone mapping. That's exactly right. It is, a lot of my tone mapping methods use a log2 transform to basically create this massively compressed tonal range, and then they are shaped with various other adjustments or more equations after that, or like an sRGB gamma transform, device transform, that type of thing. So yes, you're bang on there. It's essentially going into log space and then being shaped. It's just that around that log space, you know, you change values, you do other calculations and so on, and that's how you get the effect of, you know, more or less the differences in the tone mapping methods there. I can't read. Sorry, there's a YouTube heart icon in the way of Emiliano's comment. Does this non-destructive something trick also work with mask layers? Non-destructive blur trick. I'm trying to think. I'm going to hazard a guess at no, Emiliano. You can, I think you can apply a quick effects, like a Gaussian blur, to a mask, but short of, I think you would have to do a pen, like the poly curve, and then you'd have to drag it onto the thumbnail of a layer to mask to that. So you could use this curve as a mask, for example, if that's what you were referring to, I'm not sure, with a blur on it. So yeah, you just drag that onto the thumbnail of something to mask it. For example, if I dragged it onto the pixel layer here, it would mask. Let's just turn that off as well. It would mask based off that. I'll turn all those other layers off so you can see that there. There you go. So we've got the curve masking just this area, like you can see. And if I bring the opacity up to 100, yeah, this is looking a bit crazy now. Apologies, but I'm just showing you that you can use a pen curve to mask objects with it. Okay, so where was I in the layer stack? Let's get back here, I think. Yeah, okay. Right, time for a change of mood, I think. I've got a nice little technique I like to use. So I had a white balance adjustment. Again, I've created a shortcut for that, so that is on the adjustment layer menu there. And I'm going to drag the white balance up. Let's make it quite warm. Then I'll set the blend mode to multiply. We're not quite done yet. So go on to the blend options, and on the source layer ranges graph, drag that down like so. Okay. And then on top of that, I'll add a brightness contrast adjustment. Maybe just punch the brightness up a little bit, bring the contrast up significantly like that. Okay. And it's almost like a sepia type tone going on. I'm not particularly happy with it, but I am going to do a bunch of editing, and then I'll probably take the temperature back down a little bit after the fact. Yeah, Doug, I could also convert it to black and white. That's a viable option for this, I think. Let's keep going with this, though, and see where we end up with it first. So if maybe looking a little bit crushed. So what I might do underneath the brightness contrast is add a levels adjustment and just bring the output black level up slightly. Something like that, okay. Okay, yeah, I think I'm going to delve into my macros again here for the Luma masked curves. I'll use the weighted version. Okay, so let's have a look then. On the highlights, I think I'll try and bring these highlights up a bit. Let's zoom in so we can see what's going on here. But then just take them down at the very top. Something like that. Midtones, let's have these down a little bit and just bring them up slightly. And then I think, let's have a look. Shadows. Yeah, I don't want to make them any darker, so maybe keep that where it is, but push some detail up here, perhaps. Something like that. Okay, let's evaluate what that's doing. So let's hide those. This is before and the after. So it's so subtle again. But again, I do like making these little subtle changes sometimes. It's fascinating building up this kind of, complex layer stack, and then every little thing is contributing slightly. Okay, let's see. Let's go for a diffuse glow effect. Add a Gaussian blur, live Gaussian blur. Drag the radius up. Let's set that to hard light. And then on the blend options, I'm actually going to drag both graphs down on the black node or the shadow node to blend it out. And also what I might do is just get the paintbrush tool, set the color to black, and just paint off the Gaussian blur mask around the cloud detail. Okay, so we're getting rid of it in the clouds of the sky, but if you see the before and the after, we're affecting all of this detail down there. So that's quite nice. I love that sort of glowy blur look to it. Okay. Then I'll add another white balance adjustment, and this time I'll cool it down slightly. There we go. It just takes the edge off the whole sort of sepia red tonality going on there that I wasn't really a fan of, to be honest. And then maybe a brightness contrast and just a little bit of contrast, something like that. The God rays are maybe too strong now, so let's see, what could I do? I could go in here, go to the curve layer, take that down to maybe 30%. Okay. And what's going on over here? I think this might be Which layer is this? Yeah, okay, so I'll get the erase brush tool and I'll just erase away from that detail there. Or in actual fact, what I'll do is undo that, and then I'll set my brush opacity to about 50, maybe even 20, and I'll just kind of do these smaller brush strokes away at the edge to kind of graduate it a little bit instead. Okay. Okay, so I'll be honest, not my finest work. I'm not really sure that I particularly like this end result, but nevertheless, I thought it was an interesting combination of techniques to show you all. I mean, here's the before, and this is what we can make out of it, you know, so I don't know. Some people might be happy with that. I'm not particularly. It's I have done a much better edit of this, but for the purposes of a demonstration, hopefully it's got some interesting techniques in there for you. Yeah, crop wise, I might just try a panoramic crop as well. Maybe something like that. Okay, yeah, still doesn't endear me to this result, but hey, it's part of the process. You don't always get winners. Okay, hopefully I'll get a winner with this next one. This is another HDR image that I'm going to use. So this is South Stack Lighthouse in Anglesey, Wales. Very popular subject. Again, I'm going to turn off noise reduction and tone map HDR image. Let's go for that. Okay, let it do its thing, and there we go. Okay, so again, I just want to make sure on the 32-bit preview panel, if I was on an HDR display, I would want to turn off EDR or HDR down there. Just make sure that's set correctly. Okay, let's have a look at the tone mapping then. So I could try neutral again. That's nice. It's just a little bit lacking in color. Maybe we should try something like color preserving. That's quite lovely. I tend to avoid color preserving because I find it easier to add color than to take color away, if that makes sense. But you know what? I quite like this. So let's work with it. In the live filter here, I'm going to go into the procedural texture, and you can actually change the white point. So for most imagery, something like 8 is sufficient, but if you've got like an intense light source like the sun, you might want something a bit more aggressive, like 50. There we go. So we can see more of that into that detail there. Okay. And then actually, sorry for all the jumping around by, I'm going to get the macro panel back out because on this macros list, there is a flatten macro that I can use if I'm really lazy, which will flatten my document for me and convert to 16-bit sRGB. Okay. Right. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is retouch the power lines. I'll get rid of them. And easiest way to do this, I think, rather than going in ham-fistedly with a big brush or anything like that, is to use the freehand selection tool. And I'm going to use the polygonal mode, the second mode along. And I'll do this in sections. So let's drag to around there. Select these lines, double click to close, then edit in Paint. Okay, do the same for this power line. So let's do that. Double click, edit in Paint. Coming down here, handily, the power lines sort of disappear into the sea. So I only really need to go about that far. And then hopefully if I in-paint that, it won't pick up. Oh, it's done it a little bit. Okay, so sometimes it picks up information from the other, the nearby adjacent areas. So what I'll do instead then is I'll make a selection of, I'll come out to about here, I think, then go in here, go up to around here, come back down, make a selection of that next power line, like so. And then come back up here, come back up. Okay, and then across here. And actually, I'm going to include the third power line in the selection. Excellent. Okay, close that in Paint. There we go. Power lines removed. Okay, let's crack on with the actual editing then. Oh, how do you move while selecting? So when you're making Oh, sorry, that was the flood select tool, not the freehand. There we go. When you can either pan by, when you naturally get to the edge of the document view, it will pan for you. Or I use middle mouse and drag to pan. Or alternatively, you can hold down space and that will temporarily switch you to the view tool, and then you let go and you're back in whichever tool you had. So 3 different methods there. Okay, right. Let's get my macros. Sorry, I know that's getting old, isn't it? Let's add Lumimask curves, but I'm not going to use the weighted variants this time. Basically because I like this color intensity. I want to sort of push it a bit further if I can. So highlights, let's take these down slightly. Look at that, we've got even more nice color detail here now. Midtones, let's just do a basic contrast curve with that. And then shadows, I don't know, let's take these down a little bit. Maybe something here. Something like that. Maybe not too much though. Okay. All right. Yeah, I might want to tame this blue sky a little bit. So let's go to the top. Let's add an HSL adjustment. Okay, blues. I don't think those are quite the right shade of blue. So instead I'll use the picker here. Let's see what that does. Ah, yes. Okay, so it's moved the HSL wheels slightly. Okay, let's take the luminosity down on those. Not too much, otherwise it starts to look a bit strange. But that'll just create a bit more contrast between the blue sky and the clouds. Okay. You know what? I'm going to do it again. I'm going to use that local contrast and texture macro. I realize it's easy to overuse these things, or they become a little bit of a crutch. But I do like the effect this has. Obviously not at full strength, but when you invert it, you invert the mask, and you paint it back into specific areas, you get this nice enhancement effect. And then maybe the island as well. Yeah. Maybe just subtract it there using black. And then you can take the opacity down, so 50%, something like that. And then you end up with this nice kind of restrained, look, you'll see the before and the after. It's kind of like extra contrast, extra detail in these areas here with minimal work, essentially. Okay. Now, here's a little tip to soften contrast as well. I'll just go to the top of the layer stack. Use a levels adjustment, push the output black level up, and then slide the gamma across to the right, which will, in a nonlinear fashion, will darken tones. And so you end up with this kind of, look, I'll show you. Here's the original, so it's got a bit more contrast. And here's the levels adjustment. And everything's a little bit slightly darker, but also the contrast softens off as well. And yeah, it looks quite nice. Plus you get that sort of matte black appearance in the shadows. That said, though, what I will do is add a brightness contrast adjustment, and then I think I'll actually pump the contrast up significantly. So I know it's a bit of an odd choice. You know, why would you do a levels adjustment to reduce contrast and then add a brightness contrast adjustment, put loads of contrast back in? But if I show you what it looks like without that levels underneath, that's what it looks like. So now it's really contrasty, which is kind of okay. If I was roasting myself, I suppose it would be a little bit akin to a camera phone image from 2015, maybe. Something like that, you know, a little bit too harsh in the contrast, can't really do much with it. But once you add that levels adjustment, it just softens out nicely, and you get these nice, subtle, rich black tones instead. Okay, let's go for an HSL adjustment now. Okay. I think, you know what, I've done this a lot in training sessions recently for firms that use the Affinity apps, and I think it might be nice to go over the difference between HSL and HSV in terms of what it actually means visually for you when you're retouching imagery. It's all to do with the relationship between saturation or the color intensity and the luminosity or the brightness or the value. So HSL is hue, saturation, luminosity. HSV is hue, saturation, value. You may also know this interchangeably as HSB, which is hue, saturation, brightness. It's probably easier just to show you. So if I get, say, the reds and I punch the luminosity up all the way, look what happens. It increases the brightness or the luminosity of these tones rather, but they're now desaturated. So then you have to compensate and you have to put the saturation up. But it's not quite the same. You don't quite get that same color intensity. So instead, if I take the saturation down, otherwise this will look horrendous. Now, if I switch to HSV, notice that I can use the luminosity shift slider, which should now actually be value, to push the value of the reds up, but I'm also not losing the color vividness or the color intensity there. So that's essentially, that's why you would use these two different models. Okay, I'm going to do something a little bit fun now. So I have this set of filter gallery effects that I like to maintain. Mainly made them for architecture companies and that sort of thing using Affinity, and they want kind of like watercolor wash effects, pencil sketch effects and so on. But I kind of gradually expanded it for more kind of practical photographic things as well. For example, you know, you've got your diffuse glow in there, things like that, enhance depth and contrast, which is a bit overkill for this image, moody matte look, that sort of thing. That's quite nice actually in some ways, but we won't go with that for now. But also I like to muck around with procedural effects. And I made this procedural light explosion, which looks, you know, what's going on there to begin with. So you go in here, you click on the light explosion filter, and then you drag on your document view to position the origin. So we want that where the sun is, roughly here, okay? You can change the angle and also the God ray shape. So let's go for something like that, okay? Turn on the color tinting layer. And then maybe take the opacity down 40%, something like that. But now what you have is almost like this kind of parting light or smearing effect you see there. And you can kind of alter this by going into the light explosion layer, changing the God ray shape, as you can see there. So that's pretty cool. And it's all totally procedural. So you save on file size. And also it means that you don't have to hunt around for, you know, like lens flare images to composite on and that sort of thing. It's all just generated procedurally using mathematics. So it's quite fun to work with that kind of stuff. And I like to set myself little challenges to recreate these sorts of things and do it non-destructively. So that's quite funny. Funny? It's fun. Okay. There's other things like a procedural glow as well. I'll just show you that quickly. So you reposition the glow where you want it on your document like so. So let's put it over the sun. I won't really bother with any of these, to be honest. It's already got like a color tint, so now I just need to take the opacity down. And again, I've got that kind of, you can see there, it just adds that little bit of glow over the far island with the lighthouse on. So again, it's one less thing where you have to kind of look at stock images or rip some images off the internet or use an asset pack or something just to get like a bit of extra glare over a subject or the background. Okay. Right. I think I'll do a curves adjustment, something like that. Just bring those tones down slightly. Nothing too dramatic. There we go. And I think, just to finish this off, let's do some bandpass sharpening. It's actually a little bit too strong for my tastes, so maybe 50% opacity. There we go, and it just adds a nice, very thin layer of detail enhancement over everything. Okay, so that's probably not my best, not my worst edit of this image so far, but it's okay. It will do, and hopefully it gave you some interesting tips and techniques there. So let's save that. Okay. Might come back to that at a later date. Okay, let's see. What's next on the list? Oh, I think we're pretty much at the end. Well, maybe. It depends if you can convince me to do one more after this, which I haven't really planned out at all. So it could go horribly wrong. But okay, so back to wildlife imagery. I'll take a swig of water as well. Okay, so for the raw development, let's lower the black point slightly. And you know what? Also, it's not overexposed, but I'll just take the highlights down. It's really subtle, just to take the edge off the the highlight intensity there. Okay. So let's do some in painting. I've got that. I'm not quite sure what that is on the, near the blue tit's eye, but I'm going to get rid of it. I don't like it. So let's get a pixel layer on there. Get the in painting brush tool, set the sampler to current layer and below, and just brush in there. Okay, and there's a speck there, which is a little bit distracting as well. Okay, good. Maybe this little mark on the beak as well. Okay. Very small changes, but again, I do them non-destructively on this pixel layer instead of overwriting, or rather rasterizing the raw layer to a pixel layer. Okay, let's see. Yeah, okay, so I'm probably going to do the usual, as you can guess from the previous images. I'm going to get my selection brush, make a selection of the blue tip. I use quick masking actually to see what's in my selection. So again, that's Q on the keyboard to enable that mode. Let's see. I might select the feet as well. Just go in there, get a bit of the feet in this selection, like so. Okay, and then let's jump in and refine it. Okay, so let's matte the fur here. The hair. Okay, jump in. I'm pretty happy with that in terms of a matted selection, so let's click apply. Okay, and then I'll do my usual. In fact, you know what? I won't. I'll use a macro instead. I actually forgot I made a macro because I ended up doing this so often. And obviously when you do things, constantly, it just becomes a bit of a pain. So I've got a foreground, background masking setup here, which I'll use. So that takes a selection, does all the work for you, puts it into groups. And actually what it also does is does the denoising for you. So the noise is already removed from the background. So I don't have to bother with that. I just have to go in and adjust the curves and HSL for background and foreground. So in background, let's go in for curves. I won't use the weighted one. I'll use the normal one. Let's take that down slightly, not too much, because it can start to look a bit obvious. The HSL will do the same. Oh, sorry, that's on the reds. Take that down, like so. Go to the foreground curves. Let's push that up ever so slightly, but I have to be really careful here. Yeah, okay, so it's not looking too good here. It just looks a bit naff, if anyone's familiar with that English term. Let's just mask away from these edges so I don't get that halo effect. Okay. Yeah, okay, that's better. And then HSL, I'll just increase the saturation slightly as well. Thank you for watching, Michael. Really appreciate it. Hope there's been some interesting stuff here. I'll publish it afterwards, so you can always catch up if you want to see what else is happening. Okay, where am I then? So I've done my foreground, background. I think maybe I might just add a painting layer. Actually, you know what? I'll show you the macro for that as well. May as well. So all the time I've been doing a new pixel layer, setting an overlay, blend mode, etc. I did eventually create some macros to make this quicker for me. So that's an overlay painting layer macro. Set to 25% opacity, which is a nice sort of average value for most workflows. Just paint white into the eye there, like so. Okay, and there we go. We can see it's not doing a big dramatic thing, but it's just kind of bringing out that eye detail slightly. And then I think also I'll use matte contrast lift, which is a combination of a matte look appearance, which is actually done with an equation, but you could use levels or curves or anything like that. And then a brightness contrast on top. And sometimes I use it where I'm not really sure what direction I'm going in, and I just want to kind of make it overall look a bit nicer, bring everything away from pure black, just give it a little bit of nice tonality. What I will do though is get the foreground mask, that one there, and I'll add a selective color adjustment masked to that. Just deselect there. And on the reds, I'll take the cyan down. Not much happening yet, but let's go across to the yellows and take the cyan down. Whoa, okay. That's a bit too far. So that's quite dramatic. Let's take that about halfway maybe. And then bring the yellow up. And then let's go full tilt on this. Cyans, yellow down, cyan up, blues, cyan up, yellow down. Look at that. That's very colourful. So pure yellows and reds there. Here's the before, here's the after. It might be a little bit overkill at the moment, but I'm just going to stick with it for now and see how I feel at the end. Okay, you know what? I'll also do a live clarity filter. Bring the strength up. Then invert that. Paintbrush tool. Paint in with white over the blue tip. It's a little bit strong by default. So yeah, let's try 50% opacity. And there's a before. There's the after. So it just brings out a little bit more detail in the feathers here. Okay. So what next, I wonder? Yeah, it's perhaps looking a bit too colourful. So I'll tell you what, I'll use Luma Masked HSL. So this is much like the curves macro. So it sets up 3 adjustment layers and it blends them into the highlights, midtones, shadows. But it does it with HSL instead. So for example, I can go into the HSL highlights layer, and when I take the saturation down, it only affects the highlight detail. So I could take the saturation down here, for example, just slightly. And then I could go into the midtones, maybe take the saturation down there as well. Nothing too extreme, but just to take the edge off the really bright yellows and yellows and blues, sorry. And then shadows, I might actually increase. So you can see what happens there. It's easy to go too far, but just at a lower value, it just increases the saturation over here slightly, which might be quite nice. Let's see what practical difference that makes. So here's before, here's after. Okay, yeah, that might be a look we're going for. That's okay. You know what though? I'll get the painting layer, that's the eye, and I'll alt-click and drag that to the top as well, just to duplicate it. And so now the eye really it sticks out quite a lot. Maybe take the opacity down slightly. Okay, and then I'll do bilateral, sorry, not brightness contrast even. Add bilateral on the mind there. Push the brightness up slightly, push the contrast up. Okay, something like that. And then maybe HSL for the blues. Just take the blues down a little bit as well. I just feel that that's just slightly too strong again, you know. Okay, now, I will try a slightly different sharpening method here. I will try bandpass sharpening, but I actually think that's, even at very low values, that's quite coarse. I don't like the kind of contrast effect it has on all the fine detail here. So, let's get rid of that. I'll try something like bilateral sharpening instead. So what this does is it runs a bilateral filter, very much like I did at the start, uses a subtract blend mode, creates a mask from that, so an edge mask, and then applies sharpening to that edge mask. It's not quite as aggressive as the bandpass sharpening, but I can go in and change the mask strength. So that's far too strong. But I can take this down maybe, so it's more like a really subtle enhancement. Again, so subtle. There's before, there's after. You'd probably have to actually be full screen on your YouTube player video to see the plausible difference there. Okay, let's crop this quite small. Most wildlife photographers they will know this pain. You know, you can only get so close to certain subjects. So you do have to sometimes crop in quite aggressively. I'll maybe go for a little bit more of a portrait look there. Yeah, okay. And then problem now is I've got this area here and this area at the bottom. They're too distracting for me. So let's go all the way down there. Create another pixel layer. In painting brush tool, current layer and below, that's good. Bring the brush width up, brush over that, and then brush over this like so. Okay. I think I'm going to leave it there because I'm quite happy with that. I think, for now. So let's save this, and there we go. That is that the 6th image I've edited. So we're now getting on for just over an hour and a half of editing. So I'm kind of tempted to leave it there, unless people would really like to see one more final landscape example. I did lean into my macros a little bit more heavily for this, but still got a healthy number of viewers, so I may as well. Okay, let's go for it then. So here's a final landscape example, and hopefully, I forget who it was that asked about, will you be showing how to really bring out nice landscape detail? Hopefully, this really addresses that, because I'm going to change this image quite dramatically and maybe alter the kind of the feel and lighting tonality of it. Okay, so for the actual, this is Wastwater in the Lake District, by the way, if anyone's ever been there. It's about an hour's drive out of anywhere meaningful, really. You follow these winding roads along, there's single lane tracks and so on. And then finally you end up at this, and it's difficult to capture the vastness of it photographically, because the lens just sort of, even a wide-angle lens, which is supposed to be more dramatic, it just sort of compresses it all and makes it look a bit underwhelming. But we'll try our best to make this look decent. Okay, so raw development. Amazingly, I'm going to do more than one thing. I'm going to take the exposure down slightly, and then take the highlight down maybe just a little bit. I don't actually have any clipped highlights. I just want to compress the highlight range just a little bit. That's probably a bit too excessive. And then also, a neat little trick. When you're shooting with wide-angle lenses and photo applies automatic corrections, what it may end up doing is actually throwing away, well, not throwing away exactly, but because of the correction, some of your image detail ends out outside of the current document crop. So if I take the scale down to 98, yeah, okay, so you start to see some alpha background areas, but 99%, I know it's not a great deal, but by taking the scale down 1%, I've just gained a little bit of extra detail at the sides of the image. So I'll take that. That's a win. Okay, let's develop. Move back to the main photo persona, and I'll add a curves adjustment straight away. Yeah. If you absolutely, if you go to my website, go to I think it's the contact page. My email address is there. Feel free to just email me with, if you've got any questions or you want to send me some of your work that you've done in photo. Absolutely, please feel free. Thank you, Geordie. Much appreciated you hanging on this long, especially as well. And I hope the scope panel piques your interest, and you find a more effective way of working with it. Okay, so curves. Nothing too groundbreaking here. Let's just push tones down a little bit. I'll maybe do a pixel layer, overlay blend mode, 20% maybe. Get the paintbrush tool, paint into the middle here just to lighten everything a bit. Switch across to black, darken the foreground. Okay, so I do want to keep the foreground compositionally, I think, but I just don't want it to be as bright as the main focal point, which is going to be here. Okay, then another pixel layer, overlay blend mode, 20% opacity. Let's see. Let's try and darken the sky. Wow, that looks really moody. Okay, and then maybe a bit more light into the middle. Something like that. Okay, good. Maybe actually I'll take the first layer's opacity down to 10%. How about that? Yeah, let's try that. Okay. Now actually, seems a bit strange, but I'm going to take the brightness down slightly. And then I think I'll use, what did I do for this? I think I used my matte contrast lift macro. So it's that one. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so it just brings everything away from pure black, just kind of gives it that matte black appearance, which I'm quite a fan of in most cases. And then I've also got landscape and sky separation macros. These are for when I'm feeling really lazy. This is effectively, it basically just it decreases luminosity on the blues, increases luminosity on the reds, yellows, and greens by certain amounts. That's all it really does. But maybe too strong, so let's take this down to about 50%. Okay, and then I'll also use structure enhancement sky. So this applies a live clarity filter, but it blends it just into the brighter detail. So it only really affects the cloud detail, as you can see here, and most of the rest of the image is pretty much untouched. So that's how you get nice moody clouds. Look, you'll see here, it's just a live clarity, live clarity filter, but it's got a luminosity range mask in it that blends it out of the highlight detail. Okay. So, you know what? Oh, he's going to do it again. Local contrast and texture. Run that on the raw layer at the very bottom. Oh, here we go. Come on. It's having to think. There we are. Invert that because that looks horrendous. And let's just paint it into the foreground. So again, I'm not going to use this at full strength. Just mask it. There we go. Okay. And then, let's see. Maybe we should take it down to about 50%. So again, let me show you. That's really dramatic for something like this. If I show you the before and the after, that's quite a big difference. Okay. And then I think also I'll use a punchy sky. Oh, drag that to the top. I think I used punchy sky. Yeah, it's a little bit too strong, so maybe take the opacity down as well. So I'm starting to desaturate the tones a little bit, which maybe I don't want. So now I'll use a selective color adjustment. Let's have a look at the reds and take the cyan down there. Okay, so if we can see what that's doing, especially down here. Yellows, let's take magenta down, I think. Let's try that. And then yellow up. Okay, so we're starting to get some nice kind of lush yellows and green tones in here. And then I'll use an HSL adjustment. And I'm actually going to use the HSV color models for this. So remember what I explained earlier. This will kind of change the relationship between saturation and the brightness or the value so that I'm not sacrificing color intensity or vividness when I'm pushing the luminosity or the value up. So let's push the red up. Let's push that quite far. Yellows, let's try that as well. Whoa, okay. Radioactive grass, yeah. Maybe take that down a bit. Cyans, let's take that down. And do the same for blues. There we go. So let's just evaluate what that's doing. In fact, what these two things are doing together. So here's the before, here's the after. Okay, we're getting some nice tonal shaping going on here. Now I'm going to show you how I'm going to completely transform this image, and I'm actually going to use the lab color space to do that. Now, I'm going to show you the macro, and then I'm going to show you how to recreate it. So I have this gold punch macro, okay, and it does this. And to recreate it, we move non-destructively into the lab color space using a channel mixer adjustment. So channel mixer curves and levels, all three of these. You see the output channel option up here. Underneath that, you've got the color model, and you can actually switch, even if you're in RGB, let's say you want to use a lab technique, you can actually move into lab and it will perform it in lab and then move back to RGB. Now, while this is really useful because it stops you from having to flatten and then convert your document to lab just to use some lab techniques, it does come with a performance penalty. Effectively, in real time, you're having to go from, your source color space, RGB, to like a profile connection space, to lab, and then back again. So yes, there is a performance implication for doing so. But I'll show you the technique. So on the lightness channel, you take lightness down, and then increase it to 100 on B opponent. Then on the A opponent channel, you take A opponent out entirely and you put B opponent up to 100. You get this, and then you set the blend mode to hard light. And that is how you get your kind of gold punch look or effect. This is obviously a little bit too strong, so maybe let's try 70%, something like that, okay? But yeah, this is vastly different to what we had before. I mean, look at the difference. That's, you know, that's quite something, especially the rich sort of cyan tones in the sky. I might add an HSL adjustment and just on the reds, take the saturation down there. Perhaps they're a little bit too strong. And then also maybe add a brightness contrast adjustment. Push brightness up, push contrast up a little bit, maybe not too much. Okay, looking all right, that I think. And then we'll finish off with some sharpening again. So, in fact, you know what? I'm going to get rid of that macro panel and I'm going to show you how to set the bandpass sharpening up manually. So, we don't have to use a group. We could use one just to stay organized, but I'll show you just how to do it on the fly. So, add a live high pass filter. Make it monochrome. You don't have to, but for most cases, it makes sense. And then you, depending on how strong you want your sharpening to be, this determines almost like your base value. So let's start with 0.2. There's barely any detail going on there. That's probably going to do very little with nothing at all. So let's move up to 0.5. Okay, there's a little something there. We're going to set this blend mode to soft light. Okay. Then we duplicate the high pass. And on the copy, increase the value. You can determine the increment, you can experiment, find what works for you. Duplicate it a second time, 1.5. Duplicate again, 2. And maybe duplicate one more time, 2.5. So now, oh, sorry, I got set to 0 somehow, there we are. So now we have 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5. And this is the effect it's having. If we hide these, you can see the before and the after. So we get this nice detail enhancement, but without any of the kind of the ugly side effects, like, you know, when we use like an unsharp mask. So for example, if I were to, just hide all of these and then chuck an unsharp mask on instead, we go for a radius of, I don't know, 2 and a factor of 4, something like that. Look at you get this effect around the edge detail. Everything just looks a bit coarse. It's not particularly nice, you know, just using what we call a dumb filter, a dumb unsharp mask. It just looks a bit, I don't know, not professional grade anymore, basically. Whereas if we now turn that off and we use the high pass filters and turn them on, we should be able to zoom in. And I mean, at this zoom level, you're going to start seeing uglies anyway with most pixel-based content. But hopefully you can see there's just less of a kind of a what would you call it, like a black halo around, a contrast effect around the edge detail there. So yeah, there we go. That's kind of like my preferred go-to technique for most sharpening now. Anyway, that is pretty much it. That's all the content I had lined up for this session. I actually, I did time it and it came to about an hour, but somehow I've managed to almost double that at nearly a 2-hour runtime. But yes, I'll save this as well before I forget. Let's save that. So there we go. Some photographic retouching examples. I tried to find a blend. Hopefully you'll appreciate it. I tried to find a blend of repetitive techniques so that you can see them used again and again and again to kind of, you know, what's the phrase, like didactic. You know, you see something done again and again and again, it resonates much more, you kind of learn it better and so on. But I then tried to sort of vary it up slightly so that each image had something slightly different and unique as well. But there we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning into this session. I hope to see you in the next one. I'll be on the chat for a little bit afterwards as well. I'll play out that fancy motion graphics video as well. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and take care. Until the next time.